Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's cards feature a dry embossing technique with using cover dies as the main feature of the card. I've got a few cards to share with you, so let's jump right in. This first card features a Waffle Flower Sunburst cover die, and I'm going to combine that with Pink and Main images. To create a dry embossed panel, I have to set up my cutting plates just a little bit differently than I would to cut the die or to cut the paper. For my die cutting machine, I have a little cuddle bug, so these are the plates that coordinate with that. I've got my thickest plate, plate A. I have a cutting plate B. Then I add the embossing mat. I add a piece of cardstock. Then I can layer my die on top of the cardstock, and I've got it face down. Once I secure that with a little bit of tape, then I'm going to add another plate B to the top of that and run that through my machine. So I'm not going to use the plate C like I would for cutting, but I'm using another plate B. This technique works because of that embossing mat, which allows the die to be embossed onto your cardstock and not cut it through. So there's what that first panel looks like. To turn this panel into the main feature for my card front, I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending. I've got mustard seed distress oxide there and an ink blending tool, and then I'm just with the light hand going over that embossed panel with the mustard seed ink. I'll cover the entire panel with just that one ink and let it dry. Then I trimmed off all of the excess around that panel so that it measures 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Next, I've die cut several frames from black cardstock using a Lawn Fawn frame die, and my plan is to layer those up to frame up my panel to create some dimension. I'm using some liquid glue to adhere the frames together. And I'm using liquid glue just because it's a little bit easier and it gives you a couple of minutes of time to wiggle in the frames together. I've die cut 4 frames, and once I have them all layered up together, I can use something heavy like an acrylic block to add that to the top of them so that they can be pressed in place. To the dry embossed panel, I've added some strong double-sided adhesive strips that I cut down from a sheet, and then I can peel the backing of those and add that to an A2 size card base. Once I have that in place, I'll take the frame and using again some liquid adhesive, just because it gives me a couple of minutes of wiggle time, I'll add the frame to my sunburst panel. And again, I'll put an acrylic block on top of that to help hold it in place while it dries. Okay, so I've got my main little character. I've colored him up using my Copic markers, and this stamp set is from Pink and Main Koalaty Friends, and I've got some fun foam on the back of him. I've been trying to use up all my fun foam, so I'm using it for adding to my characters for dimension. And then I've also stamped the sentiment and white heat embossed it onto some black cardstock. And then I'm just adding those right into place using some liquid adhesive. And then for final embellishments, I'm taking some multimedia matte, and these are little hearts from Honeybee Stamps, and I'm just adding those into a few places just to embellish the card a little bit. And I think that pop of red just kind of makes it stand out just a little bit more. And so that's my first card example for you, using a cover die to create a dry embossed background. For the second card example, I'm using a background die by Heffy Doodle. This one's called Stargazer, and I'm going to combine the background with a stamp set by Pink and Main again. This one's called Magical Unicorns. Okay, so just like before, I'm going to set up my cutting plates. Again, I'm putting the thickest one, my plate A, then I'm adding a cutting plate, plate B, I'm adding my embossing mat, my cardstock, and then again the cardstock, the die cut, and then another cutting plate B, and I'll run that through my Cuttlebug. For this card, I'm taking an embossing pen, and then I'm just kind of coloring in or tracing those stars. Once I have a couple of them done, I'm going to take embossing powder, and the embossing powder I'm using is by Hero Arts, and this one's called Sparkle. It's white and it leaves a little bit of sparkle behind. So I'll do that for the entire panel, and then I'm taking some Salty Ocean Distress Oxide, and I'm ink blending right over the top of those. And I know the ink is kind of going over those stars, but once I've done all of the ink blending, I can take a cloth, or what I did was used a little Q-tip and just removed the excess ink off of that embossing. So you saw me start to do the ink blending with an ink pad or mini ink tool. And then I grabbed my life-changing blender brush. I find that these brushes are fantastic for ink blending techniques, and I feel like I've been reaching for those a little more often because they make it so easy for the ink to transfer onto the cardstock. So I'm ready to start putting this card together. I've got my little unicorn all colored up using my Copic markers. I did cut out a couple of the clouds. There was a couple of spots where I think I was just a little heavy-handed and I got like a big ink splotch. And so my plan is to use my little images to cover that up. I've got the panel cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and then I'm just adding some sparkle to this unicorn, and I'll add sparkle to the clouds as well. Next, I'm going to create the sentiment. Again, I'm going to white heat emboss the sentiment from the stamp set. This one reads, "Never stop believing in the magic of your dreams." I've prepped my cardstock with anti-static powder, and then using Versamark, I stamped that into place. And I'll add some white embossing powder and then heat set that with my tool. Once I do the embossing powder and I heat set that, I use a stitched flag banner die, and I die cut the sentiment out. So here's the panel all trimmed up and ready to be adhered to the card base. Again, I'm using some really strong double-sided adhesive to add to the back of the panel. And then I add that to my card base. All my card bases always measure A2 size, which is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I can trim off any of the little excess hanging over. And then I've got my images and my sentiment all laid out. I've added the fun foam to the back of them. And then I'm just using some liquid adhesive to add those into place. And then I'll pop an acrylic block on top of those just to hold those in place for a couple of minutes while they set. And that will complete the second card example I have. Okay, so here's my last example. I'm using, and this one is my favorite. For this one, I'm going to use the Fawn Rainy Backdrop Cover Die. I'm also going to combine that with Rainy Frog Stamp by Pink and Main. And then I pop in a couple of those clouds by Heffy Doodle. So this one I'm going to do just a little bit of ink smushing, and I've got my mat. I've picked out the Salty Ocean Distress Oxide inks. I'm adding some water to the ink that I smushed onto my mat. And then I realized there's an easier way to do this. So here in a minute, after I dry this panel, I'm going to pull out a piece of plastic that I have, which will make it easier to do ink smushing. Next, I'll go in with Peacock feathers, and again, I'm just smushing a little bit of ink onto that little piece of plastic I've got, and then I'll just press it into place onto my cardstock. Now for this card, I did use a watercolor cardstock. For the previous examples, I did Bristol Smooth cardstock. So basically I go back and forth between Salty Ocean and Peacock feathers, and between each of the colors I do go ahead and heat set the panel just so that I don't have too much of a muddy mess. And then once I have several layers added, I go in with Faded Jeans as the last color, and then I will set this panel aside to air dry. So there's kind of what that panel looks like. I did let mine dry for probably a couple of hours, only because I had like 1,000 things to do in between setting that panel and getting back to it. So getting back to finishing that card, once I did the dry embossing onto that panel, I felt like those raindrops kind of lost its place. So I pulled out these glitter inks, and I think they're like watercolors with lots of glitter in them. So I shook it up really well. I only have like a couple of colors, and I thought this blue one would go well and would have those raindrops stand out. And so I've just got a little bit of that ink onto the piece of plastic sleeve, and then I'm using just a tiny brush and I'm coloring in all those little raindrops. And once that ink dries, or once that watercolor dries, it turns very silver, and so I definitely got the look I was going for by having those raindrops be very pronounced. And again, it took very little time for that to dry. I just set it off to the side while I worked on the rest of the card. So to finish up this card, I trimmed the panel down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I added it to a white card base. And then again, I just left the cards mostly, I guess, as clean and simple as I can get clean and simple for my personal taste. So I've colored up my little frog. I've added him to Fun Foam. I've added my sentiment to Fun Foam. And then I've got a couple of those clouds that I die cut. I've also added some of that glitter ink to the clouds just to color them up. I did bring in the silver for a little bit of silver and a little bit of blue. I'll add those in with some liquid adhesive and that will complete my cards. Focusing on dry emboss techniques using background dyes. So here's a few close-ups of my finished cards. Let me know what you think. Let me know which is your favorite. I will leave a link to all of the products that I used in the video description area below. Also, I'll have the Copic combinations for all of my images that are listed on my blog. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.